everyone. Welcome to the CaRLA Gala live stream. We are so ready for this. So welcome to the late night show, afternoon Saturday show, CaRLA Gala. I hope you are all doing well. We want to welcome all of you. And I bet a bunch of you are wondering what you're doing here. I know for myself, I keep hearing about this CaRLA. Who is CaRLA? What is she doing? Well, I've heard she's suing suburbs, but we're going to find out a lot more about her today. So welcome. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Welcome to our late night show. So as you can see here, we have the CaRLA broadcasting station, CBS, going on. And just a little bit about today. So we are going to, one, adjust ourselves to the world of Zoom and Skype. And you are lucky that you don't have to really adjust yourself to Zoom because we're on Skype right now and you're watching on YouTube. So today we are going to talk about CaRLA, what they do. We're going to have a guest visit from Senator Scott Wiener, who's our housing hero, to talk about the impacts of SB 35. We're also going to talk to Stephen Menendian, who has a very interesting presentation about segregation and zoning and what that all means. Then we're going to have a Q&A with Louis Moranti of California YIMBY, who's going to talk to us about, well, actually, right now, what you can do if you're in YouTube, put things in the YouTube chat, and whatever you put in the YouTube chat, we will have live, and we'll talk about, it will get to me, put it in the YouTube chat, ask your questions about CaRLA, because we are going to have a question and answer session about CaRLA and what CaRLA does and why she or they are so amazing. And then we're going to talk to Chris Elmendorf, and we're going to talk Rena, who's another, okay, I don't mean to be gendered, who's another woman we know a lot about. So we're going to talk about with Chris Elmendorf, and then we're going to talk about future plans with CaRLA, and then we are going to close. So welcome, everyone. We are in a very strange time. And thank you for coming here and fighting for housing. What's happening right now is a lot of us are working from home, or we're essential workers and we're working from work. And we're just wondering, well, what happened to housing? I don't know. CaRLA's going to tell you what happened to housing, and we're going to have some heroes here. And I'm supposed to make some jokes, but I don't know. It's COVID. So we are going to quickly transition to our sponsors. So welcome to CaRLA, and we are going to talk to our sponsors who are here for you to give us some money. But really quickly, I want to say, okay, two things. One, questions. Put them in the YouTube chat comment section. And number two, donate. You can donate. There is an address. Yes, there's an address right here. Trying to work out tech. Go to carlaef.org/donate. Please donate now. And we are going to find out in a minute or two why it's important that you help. So moving on to our next section, I'm going to invite the very important people from CaRLA, Dylan Casey and Victoria Fierce, and I have all my questions here.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome. How are you doing today?
We're doing great. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to our little end of the year gala virtual event. And thanks, Greg, for hosting this for us. Should I just jump right into a summary of what CaRLA's been up to for the last year?
Yeah, it's a good place to start.
Sure. So we spent the last year, I guess, to start from the basics of what CaRLA does. We're a legal nonprofit. Our mission is to sue cities around California who are not building enough housing and specifically aren't following state laws that govern how they build or approve of housing. And the reason we have to sue them is that cities in California aren't very good at building their share of housing. And we wish that we could just send them a polite email, submit a nice comment to their meetings, and they would just see the light and move forward and approve of housing, and we'd all have plenty of places to live, but that's not the world we live in. So sometimes we need to use the courts to force them to do the right thing and provide the housing we all know we need. So this last year was pretty eventful for us. We had to deal with a global pandemic, as everybody did, but we were able to still do some good work along the way. Our first kind of big new case we brought was we sued the city of Huntington Beach. Huntington Beach is sort of notorious as the most defiant city in California as far as state housing laws go, or really any statewide imposition on local authority. They, in lawsuits we're not involved in, they've sued the state to invalidate some of our most important statewide housing laws, including SB 35, parts of Housing Element Law, Housing Accountability Act, and statewide ADU laws. But in addition to that, they also don't like to approve housing in general. So actually last year, there was a housing development proposed for an area that they had zoned for high density housing, and they disapproved it. And I think the unique part about this case is that they disapproved it and they made the findings that were required under the HAA to disapprove. So they found that there was a significant health and safety impact of this new development that justified disapproving it. But the only real health and safety impact they pointed out was that people in the new development might have some cars, and cars are pretty dangerous things. And they didn't really do much beyond that. So we brought the lawsuit in order to show that you can't just point to something like cars, which admittedly are very dangerous, to defeat new housing development. As we all know, kind of preventing high density housing is a great way to make for more car danger, not less. So we're hoping for that this lawsuit is going to go well. We're going to get really into the meat of it in 2021, so we're looking forward to that. Victoria, you want to talk about our San Mateo case?
Yeah, so the case is really exciting because it is a court of appeals. It's really cool because I also remember going to a San Mateo City Council meeting in 2017, maybe. It's kind of been around for a while, which is unfortunate it takes this long for these things to drag out like that. But this is how the law. And the city council meeting, they had a wonderful presentation from the opposition who talked about how this new development would bring in traffic and renters, and oh God, can you imagine the renters coming in? And it was just a terrible hearing, but it was really interesting. The HAA had just been amended at this point, and a whole bunch of new provisions came in that made it a lot easier for us to enforce it and much harder for cities to get around it. And in particular, some background about the lawsuit, that it's just a 10-unit building on El Camino Real. It's right next to Caltrain, or right in between two Caltrain stations. And it's a family wealthier neighborhood, and said we want to put 10 units of apartments here, and then they fitted up to exactly what the zoning called for. San Mateo had already planned for a 10-unit building on this parcel, and so a 10-unit building shows up, and they are not happy about the fact that they got exactly what they got. So they shut it down, or they voted it down, saying it was too big, it was too, subjective reason X, Y, and Z, whatever. So we sued. We sued the city of San Mateo, and we went to trial about it, and a surprising ruling from the judge. And instead of enforcing the letter of the law, which is the HAA, that would invalidate housing, this judge just kind of went above and beyond and decided, just of their own accord, that the Housing Accountability Act was unconstitutional and couldn't be applied to charter cities. And for those who don't know about charter cities in California, there's basically two kinds of cities: charter cities, and then there's general law cities, as they're called. And charter cities, they can write their own constitution of sorts, their charter, and it regulates, certain parts about them and exempts them from general city law. It's just a different way of going about it. There's a lot of charter cities, and San Mateo was one of them. Now, there's this thing in the state constitution that says that charter cities are exempt from undue intrusion from the state legislature. So the judge looked at the Housing Accountability Act and said, this is undue intrusion into municipal affairs. So the statewide housing is just like not big enough of a problem, because why should it apply to San Mateo? And it wasn't so big of a problem to justify requiring that they approve housing that follows the rules. And we're not really like changing the rules of San Mateo in here. We're just saying you have your own rules, sleep in it. So we couldn't let this ruling stand. We couldn't let this trial court just kind of go rogue and be activist and decide on their own accord that it's unconstitutional law. I mean, the state legislature spent all this time and energy to update it, and so that's why we went to court about it, and also why we went to appeal. Attorney General Xavier Becerra intervened in the case to argue on our side. So, like I said, we appealed the ruling to the Court of Appeals to ensure that the HAA applies to all cities, not just general law, not just charter, but all cities in California, especially the 101 plus in the Bay Area. Now, the downside, and hoping for a final ruling in the summer of 2021, which is really great. It's a bit longer than the 6 months I expected, but also we didn't really expect the city to appeal this. We also didn't expect a judge to just kind of... We're really excited to share our brief with you early next year when it starts coming out. We're ready to publish it. We'll also be able to share the briefs that the Attorney General put forward, and we've also got a number of amicus briefs being submitted, and those are all going to be very interesting, and we're very excited for when that's able to be made public early next year. So I'm looking forward to that, and you should look to it too. It's really good. But besides,
So
we've got some new ADU standards that are sort of related to this that Dylan's going to...
Yeah. So really quickly, I think this is all very, very interesting. And I just want you to emphasize for people out there who maybe aren't very policy wonky, like so CaRLA is really making an impact, but people don't realize that CaRLA is making an impact. So what has happened, we're going to get to that with some talks later, but what would happen without CaRLA getting involved? What would happen in these cities that don't build the housing, that don't build the ADUs? How is CaRLA making a difference?
Well,
So,
I mean, so we started on this, that we started enforcing the HAA, that city, experience consequences. For the longest time, they could just deny a housing development and not experience any problems with it, and it would actually defend their legitimacy of their zoning ordinances and their subjective rulings. It's really interesting that the change that's happened.
Yeah, and I think where we really see the value of a legal advocate on behalf of housing is that we have a lot of state law and state standards built up governing how local governments plan for and approve of housing. But we don't really have anybody kind of watching and monitoring how state governments do this, or I mean how the local governments do this. In some areas, the California Department of Housing and Community Development does that. But as far as individual development approvals, nobody else is really kind of following all this happening at the local level. So you need somebody to kind of watch and make sure cities are following the law. And the threat of us bringing them to court means that a lot of cities are more likely to kind of do the right thing to begin with, and we don't even have to bring a lot of lawsuits. So that's the theory behind what we do.
So what do you see as what has happened because so many cities haven't followed the law?
We see that they haven't followed the law. I think we've seen some of the effects of our work in
now that we need a CaRLA, and why in a different world, in which world would we not need a CaRLA?
Oh, okay. If there was a different world where local governments just loved to build housing and loved affordable housing and never tried to keep anyone out of their city, CaRLA wouldn't really need to monitor them. We wouldn't really need to sue them. But that's unfortunately not the world we have. We live in a world where local governments try really hard to limit the amount of housing that gets built in order to, in a race to the bottom, trying to be more exclusive than other jurisdictions. So we want to kind of flip that on its head and get cities more invested in building housing, which some cities are, and we don't have to sue those cities. But we still have a lot of cities in California that are trying to limit as much as possible. And that's why we're in the housing shortage that we have right now.
Yeah, so I think that's very interesting. We're going to have talks later about exclusionary housing and what happens. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how CaRLA is going after certain cities. We just talked about Huntington Beach, and what happens when we make sure that we go to these exclusive communities where housing is allowed by their charter, by their zoning, by their housing element. What happens, like why it is also about racial and socioeconomic inclusivity to go there and have the lawsuits to make them build.
So I think actually a case that we're about to talk about is our case in Los Altos, which is a pretty good example of this. Los Altos is almost exclusively white. And it is a place that has really kind of was founded and developed on limiting access. So it's developed as a wealthy community trying to limit other people and lower income people from living there. And they do that through their housing policy. We came in and sued them, and we won pretty convincingly. And what we saw is that in this last election, we saw a bunch of city council members elected, and part of their platforms were, we need to stop wasting all this money on lawsuits and just approve housing. So we see the effect that our lawsuit's going to have that reaches beyond just the small development we sued over, and maybe can subtly steer the politics in that city in a better direction.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. And I mean, so if we look at the Bay Area and how exclusive it's become, and even if we look at LA, why is it important for people to fight for more housing? Why should we not just stop everything? What is CaRLA trying to do for people like me who work at a nonprofit, people like you at a nonprofit? How is it helping middle income and low income people?
The big picture goal is we want the entirety of the Bay Area, the entirety of the LA area, and other kind of high priced areas to be accessible and livable for people of all incomes, and have people of all incomes able not only just to find housing, but to find safe housing, and housing that's not like a 4-hour commute from where they live. And we think that it's doable. There's a lot of different types of housing that people like to live in, and if we can just provide more of it in the places where the jobs are, we can have a much, much better state of California in my mind. And that's the future we're hoping to achieve in the long run.
I mean, I would agree. I live in this movie studio, apparently. So why don't you tell me a little bit about how CaRLA is bringing YIMBYism to the California Court of Appeals?
I think Victoria just covered that. I was going to talk about our...
why don't you talk about what you were going to talk about then?
Okay. One of the other developments we saw this last year was the state legislature passed a whole package of accessory dwelling unit standards. These are like little cottages or sometimes big cottages that can go in the backyard or elsewhere on a single family lot. In California, because we have so much in the way of single family housing, this ADUs present a real opportunity to add a lot of housing and add it in areas that are generally low density and kind of the more exclusive neighborhoods. So we're really excited this year for the promise of the new state ADU standards, because the state laws really removed a lot of the barriers to accessory dwelling units throughout the state. I think this last year we maybe didn't see quite as much ADU development as we thought, mostly because there's a bit of a pause in implementation due to the pandemic. But what we've been doing is we get a lot of emails and calls from homeowners trying to figure out the standards, and we do a lot of work helping them communicate with their planning departments and figuring out what they can do to build more housing on their own lots. And we also are talking with local governments trying to implement these laws. And we don't have a lot of the data yet to see how much in the way of ADU development has happened, but we think it's really growing, and there's going to be a lot of new housing due to these new standards. So that's been an exciting part of this last year.
Yeah, so when we talk about ADUs, I think for some people, just more housing in general is scary. But ADUs are granny cottages. They're like backyard units. And I think if you look at actually who's living in those units, it's people's children, it's people's grandkids, it's people's nieces and nephews. So I think it really shouldn't be such a scary thing. And then I think if you talk about a little bit why you think people are opposing these things and why it's important that CaRLA is here fighting for ADUs, which is in many ways gentle density. What do you think is so scary about gentle density that people should just feel okay about?
To be honest, I have a hard time seeing anything scary about a backyard cottage. But I know, and actually I would say that most cities in California are really embracing the potential of ADUs, and they're doing the right thing and adopting the state laws. We're still seeing a few that seem really opposed to the idea of these renters moving into the backyards of single family lots.
However, I feel like it's someone's kid, someone's nephew, someone's grandkid. It's not just random renters. It's people you knew. The single family homeowners had kids and they need somewhere to live. Like, we have to add housing because you all had 3 or 4 kids who had 3 or 4 kids. So how do we make that not scary and continue about why CaRLA's work around ADUs is important?
I think the part of ADUs sort of sell themselves because you have a lot of single family homeowners in these cities, and even if they might be a little kind of wary of this sort of new form of housing, they also get to have a rental income on their property. So they're pretty excited about it just from a financial perspective. But really, like you said, this is what they call gentle density. Like, if you have a detached garage on your property that is not being used for anything but maybe storage, why couldn't that be a home for somebody else when the structure is already there and it would look almost exactly the same? That's really like the lowest impact, and it's also the most affordable way to add housing that we have right now.
So are you saying people should be able to do things on their own property?
That's revolutionary.
Yes. And I'm also saying
zoning?
that there may be some people who are afraid of ADUs, but for the most part, people are really embracing them as a way to add housing in a really kind of low impact manner.
They're also really good for like, if families want to downsize and you're an older person, you don't necessarily need the entire single family home. Maybe you want your kids to move in, so you can go and live in the ADU.
Victoria, do we have time to cover our last kind of case we haven't talked about yet? I touched on it briefly, but not sure.
Yes, we have a minute left, so.
Do we have our first guest on here?
So I guess
you want to cover Los Altos then?
Talk about that. So let me get my notes here. They are one of the wealthier, more exclusive suburbs of the Bay Area, and they fight very hard against any kind of like housing reform. And so one of the big tools that was originally intended to address this particular problem of cities not just building enough housing is that, we need consequences when cities don't build enough housing. More than just the social consequences, but we need SB 35, which is a really powerful tool for addressing this. State legislation has been one of the most productive stages for reforms to alleviate this, and even as the legislatures move forward, local jurisdictions are still resisting and in some cases ignoring the requirements of the law, and that's what Los Altos did. And since Los Altos had fallen so far behind on their housing construction goals, that they quickly approve any development with 10% affordable housing. And in this case, Los Altos, they proposed exactly that. As I said earlier, they planned for this, and exactly what they planned for showed up, and yet they weren't happy about it. And in this case, the developer proposed exactly that, and the city responded by simply ignoring the law that they have to approve it and just denying the development entirely. And in this case, the judge not only ruled in our favor, which is very different than San Mateo, they ruled in our favor, but not only that, but they found the city acted in bad faith, which unlocks a whole bunch of new consequences in SB 35 in the law, in particular more drastic fines. And when the city filed an appeal, we asked the court to require they post a $7 million bond. The reason for this is that, if you're a city, you essentially have unlimited resources. You can fight any lawsuit and grind the developer down and grind the housing down into dust until it doesn't exist anymore, because nobody has the time to fight a 3-year lawsuit, especially when it's appealed. So the law changes that power structure a little bit, and it now requires that cities, have some skin in the game, and they have to post some, amount of money that would cover for the damages that the developer would have for not being able to move forward in their construction, which in this case in Los Altos was about $7 million. Nice thing about $7 million is that's approximately, 15% of the city budget. That's an entire department. They're basically betting their entire Parks and Rec department on blocking affordable housing. Once that went through and the court said, okay, the motion goes through, that's fine, they immediately dropped the appeal. I guess there is a price you can pay on how much it costs to block affordable housing, and $7 million is a little bit too much for them, a little too rich for even Los Altos. So this is really great because it, is a very clear and establishes that cities simply can't look the other way and ignore their mandates to build the affordable housing. And, as we go into 2021 and beyond, these housing numbers, these regional housing needs allocation, the RHNA numbers will just keep going up, and more cities will be out of compliance with these targets, including Los Altos, including Palo Alto, Berkeley, Piedmont, just to name a few. And because of this, because of our win in Los Altos, that can serve as a very strong model for how we take advantage of the ministerial approval that you find in SB 35, the faster way to approve it, simply because they're so far behind in their affordable housing. And we're looking to quickly and decisively defeat the suburbs in the future.
Yeah, and just really quickly for people who don't follow housing as closely, explain to us who these RENA and HAA people are and what they do.
Right. So RENA, or Our Lady RENA, as some people call it, is Regional Housing Needs Allocation, RHNA. And it was this program established back in, I think it was maybe the 80s, maybe a little bit earlier, that every 8 years or so, it's on a RENA cycle, they call it, the state tells every city or tells every region, you have to build some amount of housing to accommodate new population growth. And every 8 years, the governments in different regions, like there's the Bay Area region, there's Southern California, San Diego, some parts in the Valley, and all these different, ways to go about it, they then break up that big allocation into individual cities. And I was actually on the RENA allocation committee for the Bay Area. Earlier this year, we just finished up our project. And for that, it's me plus maybe 35 some other people, and all debating how to allocate these numbers. And it's split down according to, you got your market rate housing, your low income, very low, extremely low income, and then cities have to beat those goals before the end of the cycle in the next 8 years. If they don't, there's consequences. If they do, then there's no consequences.
Yeah, I was also very excited about how Los Altos went this year. I think SB 35 is a really great tool, and it's going to be definitely more widely used in the future. So I was happy that the judge came out and we're really able to kind of move that law forward and make it able to apply in a lot more places. Okay. I can just talk briefly about we also, of course, like I said, like everybody else, we've had to navigate the global pandemic. And as a small nonprofit process, we had some of our charitable foundation funders redirect some money away from housing and toward more pandemic-related causes for understandable reasons. But in large part due to kind of all of your generous donations and mostly small donations, we've been able to stay really strong through 2020 and are hoping to expand a bit in 2021. So we really appreciate everybody who's donated, and if you haven't, definitely chip in for kind of pushing CaRLA forward into 2021. Aside from that, we also, like, or however long it's been, we had our offices here in Oakland at Franklin Street, but we're going to be losing those soon. So I am very much hoping we can open up a new office and work in a real office again.
Oh no, Greg. Very strange. That was very strange. Welcome back.
Yes, thank you. I am so happy to be here to hear about what's going on with the Oakland offices. And now, so I think it's important to talk about why I think there were some people who don't know why CaRLA started, and they want to get involved and want to find out why CaRLA was founded, what prompted it, and also donate, please. We get alerts if you donate. I will send you a DVD. I might have a few left, but when you donate, you can get a DVD.
Great.
Sorry, so what prompted CaRLA to start? And yeah, I think we're having some audio issues, it seems like, on the YouTube.
Yeah.
so I will talk more slowly. But please talk about what prompted.
Sure. So I actually was not here when CaRLA was founded, but we kind of covered the intent and the purpose behind it. But just from a kind of practical standpoint, what led to CaRLA was audio issues. Okay, I think if you can hear me, I think we're gonna pause and so we can right the ship a bit here. Okay, we're back.
So again, for everyone, if you're watching on the YouTubes, please, you can use the chat comment section. If the audio is cutting out, let us know. If you have questions, throw them in there and people will send them to us to ask live. And also, please go to, no, wrong hand. Please go to carla.org/donate and give us some money down there when my hand comes back. Sorry, Dylan, please continue.
So I was just, I'm not sure how much of that got on there, but I was just covering why CaRLA was founded, and the gist of it is that cities don't generally, or hadn't generally in the past, followed state housing law. And those of us who are arguing for cities to approve more housing kind of noticed that they really weren't doing their job, and that there was this opportunity to use the courts to kind of force them to comply with the law. And it was something that nobody else was really doing at that point. So we started out with using this law called the Housing Accountability Act that we've covered to force cities to approve housing when that housing complied with all the rules. And in the future, we are looking to other parts of state law. We're looking at the state framework around cities planning for more housing development. We're looking at state ADU law, like we've covered, and some of the other tools that the state legislature has given us to push cities toward better housing policy.
No, I think that's very important. And I think just talking about how CaRLA came up from a need that was there that no one really figured out, or like was there, but people weren't paying attention to. It brings us just a reminder of our future guests. So coming up very soon is our housing hero, Senator Scott Wiener. And then we will hear again about just looking at the different ways we can help fix the housing crisis, from policy to studying facts about what's going on to like how we can use the law and CaRLA. So just a reminder, we're going to have Senator Scott Wiener to talk about what he's doing legislatively. We're going to talk to Stephen Menendian, who's at the Haas Institute working on inclusiveness and segregation work. And then we are also going to have Chris Elmendorf to talk about RENA. So very quickly, please stay tuned. Please continue to donate. and welcome to the late afternoon show. And as we do this, just want to make sure that we reach out to everyone, talk about how COVID is affecting us. However, the housing crisis is still there. So please go to carlaef.org/donate. People need different places to live. People are going to continue to need more housing as we look at what's happening with the economy. We are going to continue to need housing. I'm sure a lot of people have been questioning what's going on with housing, questioning where they live. And we're going to talk with Stephen Menendian about zoning and really how zoning affects, or zoning is just crazy. And there's no way to see what's happening with zoning in different cities. There's no way to just compile it. And we're going to talk about why that's a problem. And then we're also going to talk with Chris about RHNA, what we can do with RHNA. We're also going to talk about his journey from, like many of you probably have experienced. I personally was just someone who was really interested in like looking at cities and then realized, wow, cities are exclusionary. People are fighting these two-story improvements, even though they live in two-story houses. And we're going to talk about his journey from voting rights to housing. And as we get Senator Wiener queued up,
Greg, I had a couple of questions that I think we skimmed over there that I didn't get to address. So while we're waiting for Senator Wiener, I can go back and cover those. Unless we're ready. Doesn't look like we're ready yet. So I think somebody asked what the biggest obstacle or barrier to ADUs is currently, or I guess either currently or in the past. I think prior to this year's new law reforms, there were a bunch of different barriers. There were still things like minimum lot sizes in place at local levels, saying that like if you didn't have a 10,000 square foot lot, you just couldn't build an ADU. And there are also very high impact fees that could add up to as much as 30 or 40,000 per unit that were getting in the way. Really, I think this year's reforms, which the legislature worked very hard on, did away with most of those barriers. The biggest problems we're still seeing are mostly with cities trying to figure out how to implement the new laws. I think once they're implemented, it should be very easy to build ADUs everywhere in California. There are still some building code issues or issues with really small lots. Or in some areas, I think we're seeing sort of utility connection fees, which still can be very high. But for the most part, I think it should be very easy very soon for any single family homeowner to develop an ADU.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting if you talked really quickly about if there are people who say are looking for, my notes say a livable California. So if people are looking for a livable California, however, you could build an ADU. So what would you say to them to make them know that just because the zoning changes doesn't mean everyone's going to build an ADU tomorrow?
Well, I actually would say that California would be much more livable if everybody did build an ADU tomorrow. But basically, I think there's a lot of people who are really attached to this historic model for development of California, which involved single-family homes, everybody gets a yard, which is great. We're always going to have that to some degree. But we need to provide more diversity in the types of housing so that more people can afford to live here. And I think when you have, I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but like 60 or 70% of residential areas are devoted only to single family homes. You really could stand to bring that number down. And within those single family zones, ADUs can play a big role in providing more rental housing where there generally isn't any. So I guess I would just say that California will be a much more livable place if we can really push the envelope with housing.
Yeah, so I hope that livable California agrees. So why don't you tell me a little bit about CaRLA's work? We talked a little bit about the work that's happening here, but talk about maybe work that's happening across California and how donations at carlaef.org/donate would help us expand work across California.
Yeah, I can just talk a little bit about our day-to-day type of work that we do, because I think one thing that takes up a lot of time is that we need to keep tabs on what all these cities are doing. And there are over 500 different cities and counties in California that are every week holding meetings on new housing developments. They're implementing local ordinances about housing. They're adopting housing elements that will determine the next 5 years of their housing policy. And we need to keep tabs on it. So a lot of what we do day to day is just kind of pouring through all these local meetings, responding to people who reach out to us with concerns about what's happening in their city or town. And we try and figure out where the issues are, where we can best apply our resources. And sometimes we find lawsuits. This is kind of how all of our lawsuits have come up. We've had someone reached out to us about a housing that's getting disapproved, and we submitted comment, and those turn into lawsuits. So I think with donations, we can just ramp up all those efforts. And one of the things I'm hoping for in 2021 is to be able to staff up a little bit and potentially be able to bring some of our legal work in-house. So all of your donations will help us get to some of those goals and help us better cover all of California as far as monitoring what local governments are doing. There are a lot more lawsuits or a lot more legal issues that we just don't have the resources to get to. So we really appreciate everyone's help with that, and please donate if you're able to.
Yeah, thank you. I think what a lot of people don't realize, it's kind of like when I worked locally, I didn't realize that I could just call a phone number and get a streetlight fixed, or I could just call a number and like say like this parking meter is broken, even though I don't drive. And if you do, it's fine. I support that. The roads are very beautiful, and I've realized that a lot of the amazing views are reserved for my bike. So there are a lot of ways that people don't realize you can really make a difference locally if you pay attention locally to your local municipal elected officials. But there are some things that go to the state level. And I think that's why what CaRLA is doing is very admirable and a little bit thankless, because no one knows what's happening. So donate, please, or not, please donate. So donate, and then I think that's why we're going to have Senator Wiener on very soon. And we are going to talk about many things. And I don't know, Dylan, do you want to talk about housing element updates or RENA allocations and how you're helping make sure people are accountable to them?
Yeah, so I think we got a question that's about this past cycle. of housing planning resulted in much higher housing targets for Bay Area cities. Maybe not quite as high as we had hoped, but a lot of cities are going to have to plan for a lot more housing growth than they did in the past, both for affordable housing and market rate housing. And in order to implement that, they actually need to implement they need to amend their general plan and figure out where they're going to make room for this housing. And one of our key tasks, both us and NIMBY groups throughout the state, throughout the Bay Area, are going to have to look at all these local plans and figure out which ones are really realistically planning for the housing that we need. So that's going to be one of our big tasks in 2021 and beyond, is really making sure that cities plan correctly and sufficiently for all the housing, affordable housing that we need.
Yeah, I think all of this is really, really important. And as we talk about it, we think about how we move from the local level to the state level, and to give us a lot more insight on that, we will welcome housing hero Scott Wiener.
Welcome, Senator. I think you're going to be on in a moment.
I am. Can you hear me?
I will hand it off. Yes, we can. I think we need to switch the video. One moment. There you go.
I'm good.
We are just waiting until Senator Wiener's video shows on the stream, but we are very excited to have someone who's very, very busy, I imagine.
We're all busy.
Or someone who is also as busy as the rest of us, but in a different way. Okay, I'm just gonna say he's here. You see a Skype screen, but he's here. So I don't know. Should we start? Oh, here we are. Senator Wiener. Hello. Happy holidays.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you, sir? Generally, how are you?
I'm okay. I'm not a fan of Skype right now. Skype is a challenge. So, but it's good. I'm finally here. I'm on. And sorry for this bizarre lighting. My neighbors, they topped off their trees, and so now there's this weird afternoon light that casts this weird
Yeah, but we're just going to be thankful that we have blue skies.
I know, exactly.
We had some rain. So we are so happy to have you here. And I think we're just going to start with maybe thinking about your background, how you moved from the Board of Supervisors now to the state level. Thinking about CaRLA, just give us maybe an idea of how you have your views have evolved over time from being a local official to a state level official.
Yeah, and are you able to see me now? Because the video seems to be acting really weird.
You have.
Am I here? Am I arrived? Am I
see you.
Okay, awesome. So again, first of all, I want to say thank you to CaRLA for your work. One thing I have learned over time, both on the Board of Supervisors and now in the Senate, was when we go to war and we work really hard and we pass legislation and it gets signed into law, that's only the first step. Because if you don't enforce the law and make sure it's being implemented, then why did you even bother passing it in the first place? And so I've seen over time that you have executive agencies that just decide they're not going to enforce the law, or they just forget about the law, and that actually happens sometimes where they literally forget that a law exists. We're seeing that now around some COVID data collection stuff. And then also you have situations where you have to, unfortunately, file lawsuits. And so what you do, and the whole Sue the Suburbs campaign, I think that's how it started, is just incredibly important. And we've also seen over time that we learn who the NIMBY judges are. And I practiced law for 15 years before running for office, and I did trial work, and I was in court all the time. But I wasn't doing land use, and I wasn't doing housing law. So of course, it makes sense that there are NIMBY judges, but there are, and it's good to know who they are, so we can monitor that and all that. So for me, it was really a journey over time. I moved to San Francisco and was a renter trying to find a place to live, which was really hard. I still remember my first open house in 1997 where there was a line down the block. And then I was defending low-income renters who were being evicted, and I saw that mess in terms of this displacement that was happening and the damage it was causing. Then I was the president of my neighborhood association, and I wondered why we had to have 20, 30, 50 community meetings for a project that was within zoning. And then on the board of supervisors, of course, I served from 2011 to 2016, which were years of just huge war in San Francisco around housing, around the tech shuttles, around Airbnb, around Uber, around everything else. And I saw the deep dysfunction that went into approving housing. And it was very, very hard, especially at the beginning before the NIMBY movement really existed, where there was really no cover. So we had just not enough housing advocacy, and then the NIMBY movement came along and changed everything. Transitioning to the Senate, two things happened. First, we had a well-developed housing advocacy movement in place. But second, when I was running for the Senate, a lot of people would say, no, don't leave San Francisco. You can't do anything on housing in Sacramento. And little did they know that you can do a lot, because we can basically do almost anything we want to do around housing and land use decisions. And so being able to step away from individual project approvals and setting local rules to setting rules that impact 40 million people has been a real shift. And so we've been not only passing new laws, but beefing up the long time 30, 40, 50-year-old laws that had no teeth, and putting teeth into them and say, you know what, when we pass a law, we mean it. So that's really been for me, the evolution.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for a lot of people who are watching right now. I know for myself, the reason I started to pay attention to housing is I worked at the Berkeley mayor's office, and people were like, no to the second story additions, even though I have 3 stories and the other neighbor has 3 stories, but there's a 1-story house that wants to be 3 stories. It's too much, the shadows. So I was going to ask you how you became the poster boy for housing, but I think you just told us. So why don't you give us a little bit of insight to what you're thinking about housing this year? I know, and if people have or have not been paying attention, you have to know Senator Wiener has been the poster boy for housing, with a few years ago, SB 35, SB 827, SB 50, SB 10, not the same. But what are you thinking and hoping for housing, especially while people are distracted, or not distracted, people are rightly concerned about COVID and no one's paying attention? What are your hopes for housing while that's going on this year?
And please don't forget SB 828.
I tried to give as many numbers as I could. I was like,
SB,
numbers.
SB 828 was the sleeper bill in a lot of ways because of SB 828. Southern California tripled its RHNA regional allocation, and we saw Beverly Hills go from 2 units over 8 years to I think 3,000, and Santa Monica went from 1,800 to 9,600 or something like that. And you have a place like West Hollywood, which is one of my favorite cities, but they would always say, we met our RHNA. Well, their RHNA was 100 or 120 units, and they now have like 3,000. So I think for a lot of cities, it's for the ones that are trying to do the right thing, if they can up their game. For the ones that aren't doing the right thing, it's going to hold them accountable. And we're seeing now in the Bay Area, I think 2.5 times the arena we're seeing for the Bay Area. And I hope someone sues, honestly, ABAG.
Someone.
To get those numbers. Someone, if there's a lawyer in the house, there needs to be a lawsuit filed, because if that doesn't get fixed, because the numbers for the Bay Area are too low, and HCD did not apply the law correctly. And so that needs to be fixed. But either way, it's still going to be a significant increase. And we're seeing the drama now, good drama or good trouble, as John Lewis would say, that we're, the cities that have always been able to skate and not have to build very much are now going to be held accountable. Over the last 5 years, we've been able to make a lot of progress on streamlining and accountability and ADUs and so on and so forth. This year, we're going to take another run at zoning reform. We tried with the big, fix it all SB 50, and we went much further with that bill than I think anyone thought would be possible. It's a bill that 5 years ago would not have gotten probably even a single hearing in a single committee, and we got it through 3 committees with bipartisan votes and within a whisker of passing the Senate, and that is extraordinary in and of itself. And it really changed the conversation, and ideas that would have been completely impossible 5 years ago are now actually doable. And so that's a good thing, but we have not done enough on zoning reform. So this year, I just reintroduced our legislation sponsored by California NIMBY to allow cities to zone up to 10 units in non-sprawl areas without going through CEQA at all, just no CEQA, it's no project. So they can really just pass an ordinance and boom, they're upzoned up to 10 units. We're going to be taking another run at the duplex lot split law about converting commercially zoned land to mixed use or residential, and I think we'll see some other efforts as well. We do need to work things out with the building trades. It's really, if we don't work it out, we're going to have serious problems. And I'm sorry for this lighting. It's really weird. I look super backlit, but whatever.
Well, you look.
It's really bizarre.
Well,
this hasn't happened before. I need to do something. The sun keeps causing problems.
Well, if you got your way, we would have no sun. Full service.
So I think we have an opportunity this year, but we just have to get away from this low density, restrictive, exclusionary zoning, because it's really strangling housing in California. It just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, so I think it would be really interesting if you talked about, because I mean, you're talking about 10 units. Whoa, very scary. Duplex. Whoa, very scary. I think it would be interesting if you talked about how, I actually don't think they're very scary, how people who don't think they're very scary could get involved. So we know that you are a housing hero. Nancy Skinner is also a housing shiro. How can people who are just watching get involved, make sure if they don't want to pay attention too much because everyone has lives and it's COVID, how can regular people get involved to support you? You talked about how there wasn't a YIMBY movement, and now there is. So how can people help?
Yeah, well, I think being involved in the movement is really important, and we have great organizations working on the Capitol, like California YIMBY, and then the work that CaRLA does, and the work that our local grassroots YIMBY organizations do, whether it's YIMBY Action, San Francisco, YIMBY East Bay for Everyone, Abundant Housing LA, and Peninsula for Everyone, and so on and so forth. I don't want to leave anyone out, but I mean, really, it is an amazing grassroots movement. And I think just supporting these organizations, the Housing Action Coalition, San Francisco, we just have to keep expanding the movement. And we know that public opinion is on our side. That's not even a close call. Every time you pull anything about housing, whether it's SB 50 or something else, statewide, Bay Area, San Francisco, it pulls off the charts. People get it, and the politicians are behind. And the NIMBYs are a very loud minority. So let's just keep building the movement so that we can actually reflect public opinion.
Yeah, completely. And I think that if we look at what's being proposed this year with what you're proposing and Senator Atkins, with the housing bills, SB 5 through 10, if I'm not mistaken, what are some things that you're excited about and that we can support?
Yeah, and we should support that entire package, and I've introduced SB 10. I will be introducing more legislation. We're going to be doing several different things to try to, especially to get some of the loopholes that some cities are using to exploit, or that some cities are exploiting to try to avoid their housing obligations. I know you referred to lot sizes, and there's FAR, and there's some of the abusive design reviews, abusive setbacks. We know that a lot of things that we understand why certain things exist, they get abused, and we need to make sure that we're not allowing that abuse to continue.
Yeah, and so for those of us who aren't wonky, which would be not that many people around here, what does that mean? Do we write to our senators? Do we call our assembly people? What can we do?
Be involved in these organizations that are advocating, because that is going to be the most efficient way for you to know what to do, right? To know, because writing your senator or assembly member about a bill right now may not be as effective as doing so the week before that member is voting on the bill, whether it's in committee or on the floor. Being engaged in organizations that tell you through action alerts and Twitter, et cetera, when to do what, I think is very helpful. But I think, bigger picture, if you are, live in an area, and especially if you're, not so much San Francisco, we know there's certain areas that have not to really lobby so much. But there are a lot of parts of the state where we have members who maybe are open but don't automatically vote the right way. And so having relationships with legislators, whether it's through organizations or just as a resident or someone who's active or someone who works on campaigns and so on and so forth, so you can really work with those members over time, is helpful. Because it's not just about bill to bill to bill, it's about building leadership in the legislature. And so there are members of the legislature that a few years ago maybe weren't doing as much housing work, but now are. So I look at someone like Sharon Quirk Silva, who is an assembly member in Orange County. She wasn't doing a ton of housing work a few years ago, but now she's a complete housing champion. She's with us on everything. She'll do her own bill. I mean, she's just she had a brother, I think, who was homeless and who died on the streets, and it really energized her. And so she's now she's just a rock solid member who's a real believer in the work that we're all doing. And so I've been talking to California NIMBY about this, that we need to empower her and ask her to maybe carry some really aggressive bills, because she would. And so there are various members like that. Someone like an Evan Lowe, who I think has always been good on housing, but he's gotten much more vocal about it recently, which is great. So or an CaRLA, there are members who are so great on housing, and we need more and more members who either evolve or who are always pro-housing, but it just hasn't been the highest priority for them among other priorities. And so getting them to prioritize it more. So it's sort of member by member. And over time, the more you build up that critical mass of members who prioritize housing and who automatically vote the right way on housing, it makes all of our lives easier as these individual bills come up.
Yeah, and I'm gonna agree. I think that is very. I mean, if we think about, like, you talked about a YIMBY movement that didn't exist and then now exists, it's people realizing what's happening. And just to close, and thank you very much for your time, I just want to ask how an organization like CaRLA, um, why it's important what CaRLA is doing, how the Housing Accountability Act could be stronger, or like just why it's important to have CaRLA while we go through this as people transition to being more pro-housing.
It's incredibly important because, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's not enough just to pass a law, you have to enforce it. And that can be done administratively or through public pressure, but often it requires a lawsuit because we know, unfortunately, we do have a number of cities who are simply obstructionist. Cupertino is the poster child, but there are others as well, and they just need to be sued, sometimes over and over again. And so that is really, really important. And it sends a message to other cities. Oh, well, finally, I'm about to end and my lighting got better. It sends a message to other cities when they're considering whether to do what Berkeley used to do, which was to just say, screw this, we're ignoring state housing laws, we don't care. And cities now, when they get the memo from their city attorney saying we can get sued, the city attorney can also say, and this CaRLA organization has sued 10 other cities that have done this, and so we need to make sure we're not getting sued. In addition, what CaRLA is able to do is to tell us, hey, oh my God, we've been litigating this case with, whatever, the city of San Mateo or whoever else under the Housing Accountability Act or SB 35 or whatever, and we found a loophole or an ambiguity that needs to be fixed. And on SB 35 and the Housing Accountability Act, we have repeatedly gone back based on feedback from litigators who tell us, can you please fix this? And so we always have these cleanup bills that happen every year that close these loopholes, but we wouldn't even know about that if we didn't have lawyers who were discovering this through litigation and feeding that information back to us from the ground, from the front lines, and then we can make fixes to the law.
Yes, so thank you very much, Senator Wiener, for gracing us with your presence and also with the ethereal light that you've had on you. Your insights are great. Thank you for telling us what we can do to help. And so everyone, pay attention. Please donate to CaRLA, carlaef.org/donate. Senator Wiener, we thank you for your time, watching you and cheering you on.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everything you do.
Okay, have a great Saturday holiday weekend or weeks.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, and to follow up that amazing appearance by Senator Wiener, we are going to have Stephen Menendian, who is with the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, who's going to talk about something that we keep hearing about, but like, do we actually know about? So we're going to talk about zoning, the lack of zoning data sets, what existing zoning data sets are there, and just what zoning does and how it's affected everyone. I think a lot of people hear about zoning. It's this big, scary thing that no one really knows about, but we should be paying attention. So Stephen's also a board member, and I think please listen to his message. There's a lot that goes into what zoning has done, and it's really affected how cities exist and how we are segregated how we're segregated. So please, Mr. Menendian, please take it away.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Greg. Before I start, can everyone hear me? Sounds like yes. Okay, great. So first of all, it's wonderful to be here, and CaRLA is an organization that I've been on the board for a number of years. Really wholeheartedly support the agenda of CaRLA. which is holding cities accountable under state law for their housing needs. And Dylan and Victoria have been phenomenal leading CaRLA through the last couple of years. And it's been wonderful to be with them. And I'm happy to contribute this afternoon on a Saturday before Christmas to try and help raise some money and funds to support CaRLA. Right before Senator Wiener was speaking, I was getting my blood up reading Zelda Bronstein's, rereading her article on 48 Hills and the responses to it. And really just, part of the comments I want to make are responsive to some of the things that she has said and others like her have said. But it's, a motivational speech before the big game. Just a couple of other housekeeping things. I'm going to show some slides to show some research, but the main takeaway that I hope folks come away with is an understanding of what the research actually shows about the effects of land use policy and exclusionary or restrictive zoning in particular. So if you come away with some sense of that, I'll have succeeded. Otherwise, it will be a failure on my part. Also, Greg, I think you're going to be accumulating questions from the chat. So if questions come in, I'll try and go through my slides pretty quickly, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for Q&A. How does that all sound? Great, I'm getting the thumbs up. Okay, now I'm going to do the hard part now and share my screen, and hopefully nothing will crash. We've had a few tech difficulties, so looks like we're okay so far. So most of you are here because you care about housing. Well, all of you are here because you care about housing, but at least most of you are concerned with zoning ordinances in particular. Zoning is one form of land use regulation. There are tens of thousands of jurisdictions in the country, at the local jurisdictions, municipal townships, and so forth, that have land use authority. So according to the census of governments, there may be as many as 90,000 jurisdictions across the country with land use authority. Now, whether they exercise land use authority or whether the state gives them the kind of full panoply of tools for land use authority is an open question. But there are lots and lots of local governments. California is a home state. Municipalities have that power. There are 101 jurisdictions, municipal incorporated jurisdictions in the Bay Area. The vast majority of those have power. Here's the remarkable thing. We've had zoning authority for basically a century back to Euclid. I'm not talking about the Greek mathematician. I'm talking about the city of Euclid outside of Cincinnati in Ohio, which there were zoning ordinances. Early zoning ordinances were racial zoning ordinances in Baltimore, one of the first ones over a century ago. But Euclidean zoning refers to zoning by use. So, which was initially an attempt to try and sort uses and prevent noxious uses like industrial uses, manufacturing, so forth, from being placed next to, say, homes and residences. So that's basically what I'm referring to when I talk about zoning is Euclidean zoning. And what's remarkable about, number one, the extent of zoning in the United States, and number two, the significance it plays in our day-to-day lives in a very invisible but a deeply structured way, is the complete and utter dearth of research showing and pinpointing the effects of zoning. And that's what this colloquy on 48 Hills between Zelda Bronstein and Michael Manville and others is about, is that Zelda Bronstein has a belief, which she admits at least, that she thinks that speculative investments are really driving housing costs in California and elsewhere. And why would that be? Well, one reason is because because land use regulation at the local level is often idiosyncratic. You have to pull your local townships or cities zoning ordinance, read it, and you'll hear people throw out terms like R1 and so forth, which are through lines across. They're often very idiosyncratic and very specific to the jurisdiction. This, and partly because there's no universal standard for zoning classifications or even base zoning formula from which they're derived. You have basically, local authorities who are devising these ordinances and developing them, zoning boards and so on and so forth. Sometimes they're modeling after neighbors or larger cities, and sometimes they're not. And then finally, there's no national or even state-based database or index of zoning in the United States to compare zoning codes. So this makes it very difficult to get data by which you could conduct research and try and figure out what are the relationships between certain kinds of outcomes and different zoning regimes. It's very time intensive to do this research, very laborious, very difficult, especially at a larger scale. Now, there are efforts, a handful of efforts to look at zoning in, say, a small number of cities and compare them, and you'll get the contemporary zoning plats and look at them and look at one city or a handful of cities. There are some colleagues at Berkeley who've done this for, I think it was 8 to 10 cities in California. But to do it in a systematic and comprehensive way basically doesn't exist. This is not for lack of effort. So instead of actually looking at zoning directly, what you get are surveys. And in the 1970s and 80s, there was about a half dozen surveys that were conducted. I just want to mention the ones that were done in the 21st century. The first major survey of zoning was the Brookings Institution in 2003. And they surveyed, I think it was over 3,000 jurisdictions, and they got, maybe even more. They got about 1,800 responded to the survey in the 50 largest metros. I don't remember whether it was 3,000 or 4,000, so I don't want to speak to the response rate, but not even close to, a 80 or 90%. The second and slightly more recent is the Wharton Residential Land Use Regulatory Index. This was what's interesting is that some of these surveys were conducted without knowledge of each other. So one of the, I think, if I'm not mistaken, some of the people who were involved in the Brookings Institution survey were actually at Wharton. And they didn't, and then when Wharton launched in 2000, a couple of years before 2006, this other regulatory index survey, they were unaware until the late stages of the development of the survey that the previous survey had even been undertaken. Most recently, the Urban Institute has done another survey in which they got, I think it was a 52% response rate, 1,700 jurisdictions in the largest 50 metros. For California, though, the most important is the Turner Center's 2017-18 survey of the almost 500 jurisdictions in California. They got 252 responses. Now, the problem with surveys is that, well, let me come back to that. Let me just tell you what some of the findings from these surveys are. So Jonathan Rothwell, who is an economist at Gallup, and follow him on Twitter, he's wonderful, wonderful researcher. He used the Turner survey results, and he found that cities that are with more restrictive zoning are, number one, more racially segregated. That restrictive zoning policy, the cities with the most restrictive zoning policies have more white residents and fewer Black and Latinx residents. Third, that citizen opposition to development, which was one of the questions on this survey, predicts exclusion of Black and Hispanic residents. And he found that the cities with the most stringent lot size requirements had higher home values, home prices, and rents. So one of the things that Zelda Bronstein disputes is the connection between land use regulation and zoning in particular and home prices. That she thinks if they play a role, they're a minor role. But this piece of research here shows that there is a strong connection between zoning, and it just makes intuitive sense, right? That the larger you require a home to be, the more expensive it's going to be. And then the more exhaustive your zoning regulations are in terms of requiring larger homes, then you're going to be inflating property values and home prices in your jurisdiction. It's hard to understand how someone can deny that, both because of the available empirical evidence and also because of the intuitive nature of the inference. Another piece of research by Jenny Schultz and Murray, using the Turner Center survey, found that cities with the most restrictive zoning have the fewer apartments, and that overall, because of this, the state of California produces very little multifamily housing. Jessica Trunstein used the Wharton Regulatory Land Use Index, and she published this, I think, in December of last year, or maybe January of this year, a new study using the 2006 survey. And she found that cities that were, this is a national study, that cities that were whiter in 1970 had more restrictive land use policies in 2006. In other words, if you just looked at the racial demographics of cities in 1970, and then you compared those to restrictive land use policies in 2006, there was a predictive relationship there. And that cities with more stringent land use laws were whiter than their surrounding metros in 2011. So she's then comparing the 2006 survey to the 2011 census data, even after controlling for their demographics in 1970. In other words, if you controlled for how white a city was in 1970, but you knew the degree of restricted land use policy, say the percentage of single family zoning in 2006, those cities were whiter 5 years later, half a decade later in 2011. One of the interesting things she also does in her study is that she looks at a legal database to see which municipalities in her data set had fair housing lawsuits that threatened or forced liberalization of land use in those cities. So she looked at basically any city that had a judgment or a threatened judgment against it between the enactment of the Fair Housing Act in 2010 and found remarkably that cities that were threatened with suits had less residential segregation, which means that they were forced to liberalize. Again, all this research supports the contention that zoning and home values and segregation are connected. And she finds that white residents tend to be the most supportive of restrictive land use policies. Now, there are problems with the research. One of the problems that Zelda Bronstein pointed out is that she thinks that the responses, the cities that choose to respond, are biased in a predictable way. I think given the quantity of responses, the N values in these surveys, the Brookings survey, and the consistent direction of the findings. I didn't even mention the findings from the original Brookings Institution survey from 2003. I agree that there are errors in the survey responses. I disagree that they're systematically biased in the same way. So just to be clear, she's basically saying that the cities who respond, the 252 who responded to the Turner survey as opposed to the 500 that received the survey, were more likely to be, upset about restrictive land use or believe that restrictive land use plays a role in housing costs and rents. But there are actually problems in the surveys, not those that she identified. The first is that they're surveys, right? When you ask someone something off the top of their head, maybe they look at the actual data, or maybe they don't. Maybe it's empirical, maybe it's not. And so there's an inaccuracy and imprecision in a survey response. And so the Turner Center actually commissioned a study of its own survey responses, which showed that the respondents actually were biased in the opposite direction that Zelda believed. They underestimated approval timelines, they underestimated public opposition to developments, and they underestimated the degree of restrictive zoning in their own jurisdictions. And the Turner survey, like the other surveys, gave broad categorical answers. So for example, it would say, and you can look at the instrument, what percentage of your municipality is zoned for single family zoning? 0 to 20%, 20 to 40%, 40 to 60%, 60 to 80%, 80 to 100%. Now, if the answer is 61%, right, that's going to be aggregated in a way that actually, in that case, would overestimate the degree of single-family zoning. But if it was 79%, it would underestimate. So survey responses are really flawed. And there's also, as you know, a number of people or jurisdictions who don't respond to the surveys. So the question is, why aren't there other organizations who are trying to study zoning? As I already said, there are too many jurisdictions in the country, tens of thousands to study this. You would need mostly a sample, but even if you do a sample, how do you decide which jurisdictions to study? Right, the larger ones like Oakland and San Jose and San Francisco and so on aren't necessarily as restrictive as the smaller, let's say, suburban or inner ring suburb, outer ring suburb, exurban jurisdictions. Well, I thought that we should do this for the 9-county Bay Area at the Othering and Belonging Institute. And we looked for funding for this, and we could not find support for this. So we used general operating support to do a comprehensive survey of municipal zoning in the Bay Area. I should mention, there are a couple of efforts to try and do clever workarounds, like studying property records, but those are equally labor intensive and equally imprecise. So we had our team pull every single zoning ordinance for every jurisdiction above 10,000 people in the 9-county Bay Area. This was 2 years ago. And then we actually tried to find the shapefile for the zoning laws. We'd email jurisdictions, and if they didn't respond, we would try and there were other ways in which we tried to get that data. And we mapped zoning for 100 Bay Area cities with land use authority. And we archived them on our website. This is kind of what it looks like here. And so here's some examples. Now, what we wanted to do, there's a lot of nuances here. I don't have time to get to everything. But basically what we wanted to do was focus on single family zoning, right? And so we divided all the land use, all the zoning ordinances into 3 categories: non-residential zoning, single-family residential, and then other residential. So non-residential includes commercial, industrial, mixed use, so on. Single-family residential, and then other residential. So other residential would be, multifamily, anything that's residential, exclusively residential, but non-single family. And we created a series of maps. So this is Concord, California. And what these maps show is the percentage of residential zoning that is single family only. And so you can see here for Concord, 85% of all residential land in Concord, the city of Concord, is exclusively for single family zoning and single family homes. Now, there may be a mismatch at times between what's actually built and what is represented on the zoning maps, and that's because there are variances, things grandfathered out, spot variances, and also because of planned development. Planned development is very tricky. We had to use Google Maps to try and figure out what's actually there. And even then, we only did that for things that were over 500, developments that were over 500 units, or parcels with over 500 units. And also, there can be residential units in non-residential zoning if it's mixed use commercial. But the point here is to really figure out how much does single family zoning predominate across the Bay Area's landscape? And the answer is a lot. So I'm not going to show you every map. You can find these on our website. This is the overall map of the Bay Area before we actually, so this was the initial map before we added the cities that were less than 10,000. And what we found is that 82%, this is one of the key takeaways, 82% of all the residential land in the Bay Area, in municipalities that are 10,000 people or more, is reserved for single family only. Once we added the 10,000 or fewer cities, it actually went up to 85%, which means that only 15% of residential land is made available for multifamily denser housing options, condos, apartments, so on and so forth. And then we created a table, and you can see how cities stack out across kind of these ranges of single-family zoning as a percentage of residential zoning. One of the things, probably the graphic or image that got the most play on social media was this line graph on our in one of our reports that basically showed that as you increase the percentage of single-family zoning, you increase the percentage white, which is, again, entirely consistent with Rothwell, Traunstein, Schultz and Murray, and basically every other researcher who's looked at this issue. We also found, well, this just shows you the percentage of single-family zoning and the level of segregation, racial residential segregation, using the divergence index. And basically what you find is that, again, as you increase the percentage of single-family zoning, you increase the level, measured level of racial residential segregation. So what did we find? We also produced a report separate from our segregation series that just focused on this. We found that cities with the highest level of single-family zoning have the highest home prices, the highest rents, but also the highest incomes, best performing schools, and we also looked at it against Ross Chetty's Opportunity Atlas and found that children who were raised in these cities 30 years ago have better outcomes in adulthoods today. What can we draw from this? We can draw from this that zoning is basically used as a mechanism of social, economic, and racial exclusion and opportunity hoarding. It facilitates the hoarding of public and private goods and resources with profound outcomes for, frankly, all Californians and people who would even want to move to California. So I'm stopping there. And I just want to open up, but I hope I moved pretty quickly. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so very much. And I think a lot of people will have seen this, and I don't know if it will really hit them as to whether, or just like, this is the academic research, but what is it very simply to people?
What it is very simply is that cities that have more restrictive zoning are using that zoning as a mechanism to keep people out. It's a mechanism that facilitates the hoarding of resources, of public goods, of tax-based capacity, and keeps out lower income people and people of color. And that's what really all land use is. I mean, land use was ostensibly under Euclid designed as a kind of alternative to nuisance law, to try and provide an alternative for the rational use of land. But that's not how it's been used. How it's been used is for exclusionary purposes. And so I would say simply to exclude people, to maximize property values, and hoard public resources. And so we should all care about zoning, because if we want a more inclusive, equitable, frankly, California, and we want Californians to be better off, we need to attack this problem through policy, through regulation, and through legal strategy and litigation, like those that I'm proud that CaRLA is engaged in.
Yeah, and I think one thing that would be very good to address is, what would you say to people who don't realize, or like they're just like, no, I'm fine, I'm not racist or exclusionary? What would you say to them for them to realize, actually, if you support these policies, it's exclusionary?
Well, I wouldn't say this to them, but I would say this to you, that outcomes are what matter, not intent. That racial inequality in the United States is structural and systemic. It's not about, Ku Klux Klan night riders terrorizing people and burning crosses up or lynching. There are certainly a lot of police brutality, but the main mechanism of racial inequality in the 21st century United States is through structures and systems that are facially neutral. They're not designed for racial exclusion, but they have that outcome. And so what we need to be focused on are these mechanisms that we live with, that are invisible, right? I mean, when you're driving down the street, you don't see zoning maps, but you see the outcomes of zoning maps. You see the kinds of development that can exist. And so what we really need to care about are, to what degree are our local land use regulations contributing to equity or exacerbating it? It's a simple question.
Yeah, and I think it's a question that not a lot of people realize that they should be asking themselves. So really quickly to close, we have a question. Do you think the prevalence of single-family zoning is a product of cities competing to be the most restrictive of housing, like a race to the bottom, or yeah, what do you think about cities and single-family zoning?
So there is an interesting literature. I don't want to get into the academic literature on municipal stratification and municipal competition, but the short answer is yes. That what's happening is cities are competing for three things. They're competing for residents, they're competing for resources, and they're competing for tax dollars. And so when people are trying to, find a place to live, they're being sorted through land use policy into different places, different niches in the municipal stratification and the kind of layered cake of municipal stratification. And they're being, it's not that people are actually selecting cities, it's that cities are selecting people, much like, thanks to gerrymandering, politicians select the voters. It's the same thing. It's that people have an opportunity to live into places that they can afford. And when the wealthiest municipalities are competing against each other for the wealthiest residents, they're using these land use mechanisms to keep people out who would make demands upon the city's resources, that would ask for, let's say, have English language learner needs, that would need extra support in school, that maybe have children with disabilities. that would require additional supports in terms of public transit. So yes, I would say that cities are competing, and there's a whole race. You could call it a race to the top, or race to the bottom, or a race to the top. What's really happening is that cities are competing for resources and tax dollars, and they're selecting residents who are going to both make the least amount of demands on public tax coffers and provide the most amount of resources into those coffers.
Yeah, and I think that's something that now all of us have to think about. And I think there are a lot of, I think just what's happening with the YIMBY movement in general, a lot of people have questioned what's going on with they don't realize they're being a little bit selfish, but it adds up if everyone's being selfish.
Well, YIMBY is about rejecting the NIMBYism out there. It's the antidote to that. I know we got their next guest up, and I'm looking forward to Chris, but I just want to say this one thing. All the zoning data that we have there, that we created, and all the research is available for public consumption. It's free. It's on our GitHub. So if you want the shape files or the data or the zoning maps, it's all on the Othering Belonging website. And so anyone, researchers, policymakers, can access that.
Yes, and I just want to recognize the work, because zoning is so crazy. If you go from Berkeley to Oakland, or just Berkeley on this street to the next street, to Oakland from this street to the next street, it's very hard to, well, there's like no consistency. So thank you very much to Mr. Menendian and his work with the Institute of Othering and Belonging. And we will now move on to a question and answer session.
Hello again.
Hey there.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
To CaRLA, though, and really excited to be here to help answer some questions. If folks have questions, they can drop them in the chat, and Dylan, Victoria, and I can discuss them. And then we can just kind of talk maybe about what I'm seeing in the legislature, or talk just generally. We'll give folks a little bit of a break, and then we'll be back with Chris Elmendorf to, I think, finish this out. How's that sound, Dylan, Victoria?
Sounds good.
Yeah, that sounds great. I just want to say real quick that I was really excited to hear Stephen's talk, and that project of mapping all the zoning was really exciting to me, just because it's so hard to get all that information together in one place, and that's been really useful to our work. And as you heard, there's a lot of connections there. And also thanks to Senator Wiener for joining us and chatting and working through some of those technical difficulties.
It's got me thinking, like, there needs to be a state law requiring local governments to consolidate how they think about zoning. Not necessarily adopt all the same, high density around transit laws, although they should allow high density housing near transit. But we just need to be able to look at a city and say, an apple is an apple is an apple when it comes to single family zoning, when it comes to multifamily zoning, so that we can better understand what California cities are doing, what the effects are of what they're doing, and so that we can correct any ill effects of what they're doing through consistent state policy. So
personally, I would like to see a sort of inventory of design review outcomes, and whether cities trying to design buildings actually results in better looking buildings, because I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I'm very suspicious that it does. I love looking at like Gaudi buildings or whatever, and sort of thinking like, how would I get this through Berkeley's design standards board? Like, I just, like you got to slip a little like LSD into the water the night before or something like that. The committee or something. But anyway, let's see if we can take on a couple of questions here, huh?
Sounds good.
So we've heard about the Senate and the Assembly. Oh, sorry, we've heard about the Senate housing package. What's going on in the Assembly? Great question. So I think the Assembly is going to have a couple of proposals that will sort of not necessarily rival but complement what's going on in the Senate. But you kind of see two different focuses, at least right now. The Senate is very focused on housing production. They correctly feel some responsibility for the failure of SB 50 from last year and want to provide some relief to Californians who need more housing. And so that's what you sort of see in their major package. The Assembly is going to be very focused on preventing the effects of COVID-19 on people's housing stability. The big bill there to watch is AB 15 from housing hero Assemblymember David Chu out of San Francisco. That bill is going to extend AB 3088, which provides tenants with some form of eviction defense and relief for non-payment of rent because of income loss to COVID. Mm-hmm. Very important. That's set to expire in January, I think it's January 30th or February 1st, something like that. So it's soon. So the legislature is really going to cram on AB 15 in January, I anticipate. That's going to be a huge focus for them. Folks should also, I really think, keep an eye on Assemblymember Luz Rivas out of the LA region. She's got two really compelling proposals on homelessness. The most significant of which I think is going to be AB 71, which is it proposes between $200 million and $2.4 billion for affordable housing construction, and to be paid for by taxes on wealthy people or corporations. That one's going to be a tougher hill to climb, I think. But it's definitely noteworthy as a focus in the Assembly. So you kind of see two different focuses here. But I'm hoping that will mean we get sort of more work done, right, across a broader swath of topics rather than a competing vision for how to move forward on housing. I think they're going to work together. I hope they're going to work together anyway this year better than they did last year.
Yeah, they kind of have to, because I think people had their hopes that we get some assistance from the federal government on a lot of these fronts, which, people have seen that work out, or rather not work out. So it's basically at this point, incumbent on the state legislature to step in and fix a lot of these problems that, for whatever reason, people thought. I could never believe that myself, but.
Totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, I've sort of been saying, if folks really want to see Congress step up in a big way to help folks in California, we got to make sure that we are winning those runoffs in Georgia. So in as much as you can be phone banking into Georgia, if you happen to be an extremely big CaRLA fan and live in Georgia, then you should vote in those races. Everybody in Georgia should be a big CaRLA fan. Everybody should be a big CaRLA fan.
I will just note on that subject. I think when we're talking about CaRLA's work, we talk a lot about work in zoning and work in housing approval processes. But we're well aware that those aren't the only issues relating to housing that are going on in the state. It just happens to be where we think our legal advocacy is the most effective. And if we're always looking for other ways, if we felt like we could sue a city to force them to approve of a homeless shelter, wouldn't hesitate to do that as well. And currently, I think the biggest obstacle a lot of times to supportive housing and affordable housing and homeless shelters is a lack of funding. But we're not unaware of the need for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's also kind of both, too, because like the funding also has to defend any kind of lawsuit. Prevent reason for lawsuits or just prevent lawsuits entirely. It does make things a lot cheaper. So it's kind of like, attacking it from both sides.
Yeah. And I mean, I think another aspect here is that, like, from a policy angle, like, our highest priority should be to, get homeless housing done, which is like that's absolutely the case, and actually kind of reflected in somewhat. It's reflected somewhat in our laws, like homelessness housing, affordable housing generally are, things like SB 35, for example, has foreclosed a lot of the avenues that local governments use to deny those projects or to create spurious complaints from the neighbors. And so, when we're thinking about the future of legislation in this area, the way that I think about it is we should take some of those laws that are on the books and expand them to all types of housing, because it would be like, I think any advocate should be working towards their own, the end of their own relevance. I mean, that's creating a situation where local governments really have no avenue towards spuriously denying a project is really the outcome we should all be working for, is the outcome we're all working for. And until then, we just get to play whack-a-mole with some of the most fun organizations and cities to whack. So that's always fun.
I think we have a question from the chat that is, what is some legal lingo that is used in local and state housing law and policy that sounds harmless, but is that it actually isn't harmless, that the average person would know about? And I think our next guest, Chris, had a pretty good answer that said environmental review. Or really just the California Environmental Quality Act sounds great. Like, we all want better environmental quality. Right?
Yeah, who doesn't like clean skies and fresh air? Although part of the problem is that, of course, that CEQA also includes aesthetics as the environment.
Right.
Yeah, and the reason...
Or historic preservation. I'd say historic preservation is like a nice, clean-sounding term that really is just used to advance the cause of racial segregation in the state.
Yep. You preserve the character.
There's a lot of things. But yeah, CEQA is a law in California that requires cities actually to analyze all the environmental impacts of anything they do, really. But as far as housing development, it requires the cities kind of pawn that responsibility off to developers, and developers have to pay for all of these studies of the impacts of the development. And this is true even for developments that are supposedly allowed under local zoning. And in some ways that can be good. Like, if a site is contaminated, it's good to know that before you build housing. But in other ways, it opens up an avenue for local NIMBYs to sue cities over approvals, basically do the opposite of what CaRLA is doing. If they think that some small piece of that analysis is not correct. And often courts will invalidate whole housing developments on technicalities based on CEQA. So that's why we aren't huge fans of that law as it is currently used. But I think Chris might talk a little bit more about that as well.
I personally, my like complaint with CEQA is that it only really looks if you're going to make the situation worse. It doesn't really have any, the way it sort of like scores things and the way you do the analysis. You can't really show that if it's going to, if you build a machine that's going to suck carbon out of the air, that's basically evaluated exactly the same as a parking lot, because it doesn't really care about improving it. It just only cares about making it worse, or rather avoiding making it worse and mitigating that.
It's a huge status quo bias, right? Like, it doesn't think about what happens if you don't do something.
Yeah,
If you don't build this infill housing, it doesn't care that means you're going to build exurban sprawl.
Yeah, for me, like a lot of our work this year has just been under the motto of like housing or consequences, because the HAA now provides consequences for not building housing. But now we got to fix the other big elephant in the room, which is CEQA does not provide consequences for not building housing.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Is there a movement towards creating a funding structure to build social housing countercyclically? So there are a couple of terms in there we might define. Social housing is sort of affordable housing that the residents are in control of, either through, a government apparatus like the housing being public housing, or some other form of a what am I blanking on? The land. What's the model where you can sort of own the land and then sort of share the ownership?
Community land trust.
Community land trust. Thank you. So I'd say yes, there is a movement towards creating that funding structure. NIMBYs are really at the forefront of that movement, I'd say. And I'm hoping that there will be some action on social housing in the legislature this year. Somewhat optimistic about that. I got my fingers crossed anyway. A substantial number of assembly members are very interested in pursuing this as a topic of their own legislation, and that's always a good sign for at least continuing a conversation into a legislative body. So, looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's gonna be very exciting. I think
in some ways, social housing is already happening in the form of subsidized affordable housing that's built by nonprofits. I guess that by a technical definition, it would have to be on a public site, but that also happens. I mean, there are developments on parking lots that you could argue are social housing already. But yeah, expanding that avenue of housing production is a really promising way to move forward as well. Should we move on to our final guest?
Yeah,
here?
I think our next guest is ready. I think we're gonna switch over to Greg right now. Sorry, let me bring him up on here.
Thanks for joining us, Lewis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to our previous guests, and also welcome back to the late afternoon show. And if you haven't donated yet, go to carlaef.org/donate. So next we're going to bring up Christopher S. Elmendorf, an MLK Jr. professor of law, who is going to speak to us with all of his UC Davis knowledge just about what's going on with RHNA, and who is RHNA, and who's CaRLA, and who's CEQA, and who are all these sexy names. So I'd like to welcome everyone. Say hello to Chris Elmendorf.
Hi, can you hear me? The audio's working? Great.
Yes.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. CaRLA is a fantastic organization that I'm a proud supporter of. I had the pleasure earlier this year of hosting Dylan and Victoria as guest presenters in a class I taught about state housing law at UC Davis, where I teach in the law school. I used one of CaRLA's cases as a problem for my students, and it really busted their brains, and it was a lot of fun to work through it with them, and then bring in Dylan and Victoria for a conversation about strategy and how it all plays out in the real world. So it's a wonderful organization, and thanks to everybody who's donated already or will donate in the rest of this fundraiser. I was asked to talk a little bit about RHNA. RHNA is a perhaps unfortunate acronym for Regional Housing Needs Assessment. California has, since 1980, had a law on the books that requires a state agency to periodically project housing need for each of 20 regions of the state, and then local governments to adopt housing plans, which are called housing elements. It's technically the housing element of the general plan, which explains how the local government will accommodate their share of the regional housing need. One of the nice features of this law is that it requires local governments, essentially requires local governments to accommodate at least 40% of their share of regional housing need through land that can be zoned for multifamily housing. The idea is that this is land that could be developed as affordable housing, social housing, if you will, though it needn't be developed only for that purpose. So we saw Stephen Menendian's maps, which show that we're still not zoning enough land for multifamily housing. But if there's one lever in state law that allows the state to put some pressure on cities to zone for multifamily housing, it is this regional housing needs assessment process. And this is a really great time to be talking about it because over the next 2 to 3 years, California cities will embark on the rewriting of their housing plans, and the housing elements that they adopt will shape development going forward for the next 8 years. And there have been a couple significant changes in state law that will come to bear on this new planning cycle that should result in the law working more effectively than it has in the past. One of those big changes, which Senator Wiener referred to, was Senate Bill 828, which he authored. And 828 changed the method by which those assessments are made. The previous method really strongly baked in existing patterns of exclusion, and the new method has a little more flexibility and has resulted in both higher numbers overall for different regions. So Los Angeles, the Southern California region, its housing target is 3 times larger in this cycle than it was in the last. The Bay Area is a little bit more than twice as large as it was in the past. The other thing that 828 does is it requires local governments to, regional governments, the councils of governments, to consider the imbalance between jobs and housing and fair housing considerations in allocating that regional target to cities within the region. So Victoria talked about the committee that she's been on for ABAG, which is the Bay Area Regional Planning Council of Governments, that has adopted a new formula, and the new formula is resulting in the allocation of much more housing to Silicon Valley cities than they got in previous planning cycles. Why are they getting more? Well, because these are areas of opportunity. There's jobs, there's great schools, there's good access to transit. These are places that should be producing a lot more housing. And it's more important that housing be built in the Silicon Valley areas than it be built in Antioch or Pittsburgh. Well, Pittsburgh actually has good access to BART, but the more far-flung regions of the Bay Area to the east are not the places where it's most important to get new housing built. So Dylan raised the question in the chat of whether I think CaRLA should sue ABAG to increase the numbers like Senator Wiener suggested. If Senator Wiener is for it, it's probably a good idea. I've been more cautious about it than he has. In a nutshell, one of the unfortunate things that happened in the current planning process is that this imbalance between jobs and housing, which you can think of equivalently as a large number of commuters coming into a region from out of the region, this is a factor that the statute says the Department of Housing and Community Development should consider when setting the regional housing targets. And it matters much more for the Bay Area than it matters for any other region in the state. And the reason for that is because if you look at Los Angeles, the Southern California region, the way the Southern California region is defined geographically is it includes the Inland Empire. Whereas the way the Bay Area region is defined doesn't include the Central Valley, right? The Sacramento area is part of a different region. So the now massive commute shed of the Bay Area is not reflected in determination of housing need for the Bay Area. And so I think it was unfortunate that there was no jobs housing adjustment made for the Bay Area regional housing need determination. I wrote a report with some other professors that showed how the jobs housing factor could and should have been used. But I don't know whether it makes sense to sue. I think that's a political judgment at this point. And one of my concerns is that if NIMBYs start suing over a failure to make the right or a sufficiently large regional housing target, NIMBY cities will also start suing and will really be able to delay the process. And there's at least some argument now that the determination of regional housing need is not reviewable in court at all. And as much as I would like to see a higher number for the Bay Area, I think maybe the resolution in which those numbers just aren't reviewable in court might ultimately be the best housing outcome, given that there's one NIMBY group or a couple NIMBY groups who could bring these suits, whereas there's literally scores of NIMBY cities that could be doing so.
So I think that's a lot for us to digest. Just to bring it back a little bit to kind of how people who will get to where you are right now. So how did you move from voting rights to housing politics and get so deeply involved that you just said a lot of things that many people want to know about, but it's going to take them a little while? And how can they move from where you were to where you are right now?
So I apologize for going into way too much detail or over way too many.
I was listening. I understood, but I wasn't sure that everyone understood.
I've actually taught property law for a number of years at UC Davis, so I've had some interest in land use issues, but most of my research has been in the area of voting rights. And it's long struck me that the politics of housing in the Bay Area, where I've lived since 2005, are in some uncanny and disturbing ways similar to the politics of minority voting rights in the Jim Crow South in the 1950s and 1960s. Right? This is a time at which African Americans were denied the franchise. You couldn't have a law on your books that said Black people can't vote because the federal courts would strike that down. But you could have other kinds of laws on your books that would say things like, you can't vote unless your great-great-great-grandfather voted in an election in our jurisdiction, or you can't vote unless you can pass a test of literacy or moral character, right? The moral character tests were unbelievably subjective. They were like the design review of voting rights. And the effect of all these laws was to create a world in which some people were simply excluded from the political community. And they were excluded from the political community in some measure because of outright racism, but they were also excluded from the political community because the people who had the vote were using the vote to allocate resources to themselves, right? And they wanted to keep enjoying those resources. And the politicians who were elected were politicians who'd been elected by the white electorate. And they saw Black enfranchisement as a threat to their hold on office. And there's a similar sense in which the politics of land use are about who gets to be a member of a political community, who gets to vote in the elections for a local government. And if a city that's now zoned almost exclusively for single-family homes, if they allow a lot of multifamily housing, that's going to bring in a different kind of person to the community. And that different kind of person will be voting in that community. And in fact, there was a moment in San Francisco in, I think it was probably about 2005 or 2006, not long after I moved here, when there was a progressive manifesto put out by, I think at the time it was the San Francisco Bay Guardian, which was the sort of the precursor of 48 Hills, about like what should a good progressive believe in San Francisco. And part of their policy agenda was we should only allow nonprofits to build housing in the city. There shouldn't be market rate housing. Why shouldn't there be new market rate housing? Because it brings in the wrong kind of person, right? And the notion of different communities being able to select, like, who is the right kind of person who should be part of that political community, that to me is just deeply, deeply illiberal. And so there's this basic structural similarity between land use and voting rights, and admit as well, and land use is often not far below the surface. It's definitely part of the picture as well.
Yeah, and I think that's very powerful to think about just how, like, these are decisions people are consciously making, but they don't maybe realize. And just to kind of wrap it up, I and many other people are like, where can we take your class? Where can we study this? So if you could just really quickly tell us, like, what should we be doing? And just like, what should we pay attention to? And just where can we learn more? I don't know. As your outro to the outro.
Well, I'm not teaching any MOOCs yet. Maybe I will at some point try to put together an online course about RENA and housing law in California, or housing law and voting rights. We'll see. But I do from time to time put things out through Twitter, and I'd say just to everybody, stay on top of what's happening in your city with its housing element cycle. Figure out when your city's housing element is due, and get connected to local NIMBY groups that are keeping a close eye on that housing element, because you want to be sure that you're getting in comments on that housing element early, that they're going to the city government, and that they're getting CC'd to HCD.
Chris Elmendorf, thank you so much. You just got me riled back up, but we're going to not be riled up because we will be riled up about donations. Please donate. CaRLAEF.org/donate. And now we will finish it out. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to our wonderful fundraiser gala. This is our second annual gala fundraiser. Our first one that we ever had was last year in, 7th West out here in West Oakland. Due to the pandemic, obviously, we're all indoors and whatnot. So here we are this time around.
Yeah, thanks, everyone, for tuning in and spending your Saturday afternoon hearing about all sorts of fascinating topics of housing law. At least they're fascinating to me. And thanks for supporting us and all of our work. We really enjoy doing this work. And also thanks to all the guests. Thanks to Chris, Senator Wiener, and our board member, Stephen Menendian, as well. Mm-hmm. Those were all great presentations, and really kind of grounds CaRLA's work in why we do what we do and how we do what we do as well.
Yeah. And thanks a lot to the team who's behind the scene that you can't really see. Louis Morante, who is, he was on camera. He was doing the Q&A with us. And Kieran Darkwater, who's been keeping time on the back end. I've been your producer for this evening. It's been really exciting and wonderful for our first event, virtual. Again, go to CaRLAEF.org, donate, do that thing. You may be surprised to learn that lawsuits are very expensive, and so we need your support so we can keep suing the suburbs and kicking ass. So thanks a lot, everybody.
support our work. We're very excited for 2021 and hoping to do some great things. So we appreciate all the support, and thanks again for tuning in.
Thanks a lot, and we'll see you all early next year.